report of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into historical abuse in state care and in the care of faith-based institutions.
That paper is published under the authority of the House. Members, we now come to a debate on the final report of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into historic abuse in state care and in the care of faith-based institutions. I call on the Right Honourable Prime Minister to move that the House take note of this report.
I so move. Mr. Speaker, this is a day that many New Zealanders who were abused in state care never thought would come. It's the day that this Parliament accepts with deep sorrow and regret the report of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in Care. At the heart of this report are the stories of 2,400 survivors, many of whom are here today. To every person who took part, I say thank you for your exceptional strength, your incredible courage, and your confronting honesty. Because of you, we know the truth about the abuse and the trauma that you endured. I cannot take away your pain, but I can tell you this: you are heard and you are believed. Many of your stories are horrific and harrowing. They are painful to read, but not nearly as painful as they were to endure. The state was supposed to care for you, but instead many of you were subjected to the most horrendous physical, emotional, mental and sexual abuse. A number of faith-based schools, institutions and people in positions of authority who you should have been able to trust failed you in the worst possible way. When you tried to speak up, those same people turned a blind eye, they covered it up and they prevented you from seeking justice for far too long. Maori, Pacific, deaf and disabled people disproportionately bore the brunt of a lot of what had occurred. And not only did this have a devastating impact on your life, but also your families and your communities. We like to think that abuse like this doesn't happen here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but it did. And it is a shameful chapter of our history that we must confront. And Mr. Speaker, this is a dark and sorrowful day in New Zealand's history. And it is important that as a country we bring to the surface and we understand the hard truths of what happened so we can try and move forward together. And I say to the survivors, the burden is no longer yours to carry alone. The state is now standing here beside you, accountable and ready to take action. Mr. Speaker, the Royal Commission traversed many types of care as part of its inquiry. And it is my heavy duty to say today the government is formally acknowledging that the experience of some children and young people at Lake Alice Hospital did amount to torture. Patients at Lake Alice were given electric shocks without anaesthetic, as well as painful and immobilising paraldehyde injections. These so-called treatments were not administered for medical reasons. They were used for punishment and emotional control. These experiences were nothing short of horrific, and they happened in the New Zealand health system in living memory. To the survivors of Lake Alice, some of whom are here today, thank you for your determination to ensure that what you suffered was brought to light. What happened was wrong. You knew then it was wrong, and all these years later, the state also acknowledges that it was wrong. Today I stand humbly before you in this House to offer a long overdue apology to the survivors of Lake Alice. I am sorry that it has taken so long for this acknowledgement of torture. I want to also acknowledge Paul Zentfeld and also Malcolm Richards, who took cases against the New Zealand. I want to acknowledge both of them because they took cases against New Zealand to the United Nations Committee Against Torture. Thank you for your courage, thank you for your bravery, and thank you for your determination. I know that for some Lake Alice survivors, the acknowledgement today that what happened to you was torture is something for which you have been waiting for decades. And for you, this is a day of great significance. For others who suffered torture, I know that this acknowledgement feels hollow without the recognition that comes with redress. I regret that it is not something that we can give you today, but I assure you it is a priority for the government in the coming months. We are here today because it was important to the government that an acknowledgement and sincere apology be made with gravitas and dignity. It deserved to be made in this Parliament. And I know that some survivors are in fragile health, and also that a number have passed away during the inquiry, never hearing the state acknowledge the true extent of what happened to them. And to their families and to their whānau, I am sorry that they are not here to hear the state admit to what we should have owned many years ago. Mr. Speaker, not every child in state care was harmed, and of course there are and always have been many dedicated and devoted foster parents and social workers committed to looking after children in their care. But today is about acknowledging those who had their childhoods cruelly taken away from them. The tabling of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care report is of historical significance to New Zealand. It is the result of the largest and the most complex public inquiry ever held on our shores. The report has taken 6 years to write, and it is almost 3,000 pages long, comprising of 16 volumes. And because of this, the content needs to be considered with respect and with care. It cannot be rushed, and the findings in this report need to be widely understood. And while we can never make right the harm that survivors experience, the government must be accountable and support survivors. And so Erica Stanford will lead a ministerial group to respond to the report's findings and the 138 recommendations. The first step is a formal apology which will take place on November the 12th. This is a significant and an important milestone, and we are working with survivor groups on the apology and the event. The apology will provide an important opportunity for the government and the leaders of other political parties to take responsibility on behalf of the nation for the failures of the state across many governments. I know survivors have been waiting a long time for changes to how the state and churches provide redress, and I want to assure you that we understand the urgency and the importance of that work, and we will provide clarity before the end of the year. I do want to pay special tribute to the commissioners and to all of the staff who worked on this inquiry. There is no doubt that for those who have heard and have written and have read these accounts, that they have been impacted by these horrific and harrowing experiences. The care, the sensitivity and the dedication you have shown in compiling this report is greatly appreciated. Thank you. I would also like to acknowledge the previous Labor government who commenced this important inquiry almost 6 years ago. A terrible injustice, A terrible injustice was done in the name of state care, and it is now the responsibility of the state to make redress, and this government will ensure that it happens. And as Prime Minister, I will ensure that the state carries its care and protection responsibilities with tremendous weight. As difficult as it is, I hope that all New Zealanders take the time to read this report, to understand the abuse that you, the survivors, suffered and the lifelong impact it had on your lives. Through this, we will understand the obligation that we all have to prevent it happening again and to speak up whenever and wherever we see abuse of anyone in care or otherwise. I want to again acknowledge the survivors for their exceptional bravery and for sharing their stories. I share your dream for the next generation where every child, young person and adult is loved, is safe and cared for in a manner that supports their growth and development to becoming a thriving contributor to our society. And I will never lose sight of what you have endured to bring the truth to life. I would like to close with an excerpt from a karakia written by Waiharoi Shortland, who worked on the inquiry, and he said, "To you upon whom this inquiry has been centred, resolute in your pursuit of justice, relentless in your belief for life, we have only our highest regard and respect. May your peace of mind be assured. Thank you.
I call on the Right Honourable Chris Hipkins.
Mr. Speaker, it's difficult to put into words what a huge and momentous day this is for New Zealand, and no one will be feeling that more than the survivors of abuse in state and faith-based care, whose experiences have been heard and now told by the Royal Commission. As I look in the gallery, Mr. Speaker, I see many familiar faces. I want to acknowledge you, the survivors, for your strength, your courage and your perseverance. How long and hard you have fought. Many of you have dedicated your lives to this fight, and many of you have dedicated your lives to protecting and being a voice for future generations so that they do not have to endure what you have. We see you, we hear you, and we thank you. And whilst a formal apology is still some time away, we are sorry. As a society and as a country, we are sorry. For too long, across governments, across generations, far too many people have turned their backs on you. The state and its institutions not only allowed this abuse to happen, it then denied you your voice and, worse, covered up the extent of the atrocities that took place. Mr. Speaker, debts come in many forms, not just financial, and New Zealand owes an enormous debt to the survivors. The Royal Commission has shone a light on a nationwide, intergenerational shame for New Zealand. We must finally hear the voices of the survivors, and we must take action. Reading the report, Mr. Speaker, I cannot imagine how it would feel to be told as a child that nobody loves you. And then, for those who were entrusted to care for you, to then set about demonstrating that through their actions. I cannot imagine the trauma, the lifelong trauma, that would have inflicted. I was moved by a quote relatively early in the report from one of the survivors. I was always unwanted as a little kid, and now I always think I'm unwanted by other people or my partners. The trauma endures. The trauma doesn't go away. Abuse in state care took many forms: shame, humiliation, physical abuse, physical violence, sexual abuse, sexual violence, weapons, electric shocks, drugs, deprivation, isolation. The burden of abuse in state care afflicted some sections of our population more than others. Tamariki, rangatahi and Pakeke Māori were often targeted due to ethnicity, and as the report finds, this was often overlaid with racism. Pacific children were similarly targeted, deaf and disabled as well. The survivors live on a day-to-day basis with the consequences of that abuse, but so do we as a society. The report asks the question, how did this happen? And I want to quote directly from the report a sobering finding. Quote, society's discriminatory attitudes towards difference, including racism, ableism, disabledism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, punitive attitudes towards whānau and individuals who need support, all had one thing in common. They devalued and dehumanised children, young people and adults in care. Mr. Speaker, those words are a siren call to all of us today. They are a ruler that we should measure our actions today against, because the abuse and state care is not over. And I want to quote another sobering passage from the report. Most of the factors that led or contributed to abuse and neglect during the inquiry period continue to persist. Mr. Speaker, if this inquiry is to mean anything, we must consider the voices of the survivors in the actions that we take today as we respond to contemporary challenges of today. Mr. Speaker, I want to, in that regard, quote again directly from the report, make sure I get the right quote, and it's from Dr. Rawiri Waratini Karina, who was quoted right at the start of this report. I was 18 when I walked into the yard, never been to prison before. I walked out into the yard and there were 50 men there. I knew 45 of them. That's because they were beside me in the social welfare homes, the family homes, and the boys' homes. So that's when I realised there was a pipeline to prison process. Mr. Speaker, we must remember that. We must acknowledge that the shameful history of abuse in state care has led to prisons overflowing with some of the survivors of that abuse. Gangs contain survivors of that abuse. Mr. Speaker, I want to address the Prime Minister and thank him for his words. Our government set up this inquiry and we'd made some changes. We changed the redress rules on an interim basis, and we did set up the Survivor Experiences Board. But, Prime Minister, we didn't do enough. And the ball now falls to you and your government. This must be bigger than politics. Mr. Speaker, we owe it to the survivors and to future generations to finally deliver justice and to finally end the ongoing abuse that happens in state care. This work This work will extend beyond the life of any one government, so we should work together to make sure that happens. Mr. Speaker, I finally want to end with the words of the Royal Commission and how they began their report, because I want those words to be read into the record of the House. Greetings to you who came to us with nothing in your hands, with sorrow clouding your hearts, the burden of guilt weighing heavily on your very being, spirits crushed by the shame that still pervades your minds, proffering a simple prayer: deliver us. We listened to your anguished memories, heard the sobbing of your hearts, and have been tasked to give you solace from the harsh winds of time, resolution from the gravity of your abuse. May the unseen hand of providence shine upon you, the wisdom of the ages guide you, and that the truth and justice we have sought together may find you respite. Finally, let us pay homage to those who did not see the end of this long journey. Those of you who now rest beyond the collective realm of memories, into the deep recesses of night, we bid you farewell. Sleep in eternal serenity, in the embrace of your ancestors. While your voices are now silent, your words will endure. Rest in peace. And in that peace, we hope you find solace in this report.
The question is, the motion be agreed to. I call on Chloe Swarbrick.
I just wanted to acknowledge the weight of history and of resilience and the potential for healing that currently exists palpably in this room. Words cannot adequately convey the systemic failures and the injustices perpetuated by the state. But words do matter. They are something to be held accountable to. And so, joining with all of Parliament, let it be clear that we in the Greens are so deeply sorry. I want to acknowledge all of the survivors and their whānau who are here. I want to acknowledge those survivors who told their stories in public and in private in contributing to this Royal Commission of Inquiry. I want to acknowledge the commissioners and the many kaimahi who made this happen today. I also want to join in acknowledging the Right Honourable Jacinda Ardern and the Honourable Grant Robertson who drove this in the last government and this government picking it up. I also want to acknowledge who should be here giving this speech. The Honourable Marama Davidson, who has long worked with survivors and who many will know is presently in cancer treatment and recovery, but it is hopefully her fire for compassion and justice that I will bring to this kōrero today. Last night, our MPs heard from a few survivors and supporters who reached out asking if there was any formal welcome to Parliament. And when we couldn't find any, we decided to do something small ourselves, and I wanted to acknowledge those who joined with us and shared their stories this morning. There, I spoke to one survivor, Gary, who handed me personally a letter to hand to our Prime Minister, and I want to tell Gary that I have done just that 2 hours ago now. You're welcome. I also asked survivors what they wanted me to say in this speech, and broadly they said that they wanted two things on record. Firstly, the apology, and secondly, what redress and justice actually looks like. Today's apology is long awaited. I want to acknowledge that this morning many survivors told us that they believe that this apology should have happened on their terms and in their turf, not in this institution which has caused so much harm. And I hope that is the government's next step, to come to survivors, not to continue to ask survivors to come to us. Now, an apology means acknowledging what happened. It means taking responsibility, and it means change. It means that the state at worst helped to facilitate and at best was complicit in the abuse of so many of the hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders who passed through state and faith-based care institutions between 1950 and 1999. But survivors today wanted me to be clear that that abuse did not stop in 1999. And there are some who continue to experience it to this day. The Royal Commission inquiry itself tells us that, and I quote, people were more likely to be placed in state and faith-based residential and institutional care if they had experienced poverty, family crisis or violence, parental abuse and neglect, or were deaf, disabled and mentally distressed. And they also said, and I quote, the effects of colonisation, urbanisation, the breakdown of social structure and racism saw Māori more likely to be placed in state care, end quote. The Royal Commission tells us that institutional care was overused for deaf, disabled and mentally distressed children, young people and adults. It tells us that through the 1950s and the 1980s, tamariki, rangatahi, Pākeke and Wahine Māori, as well as Pacific peoples, were all disproportionately targeted, monitored, and therefore placed into care by the police and other state agencies. It tells us that through the 1950s and 70s, many unmarried and pregnant girls and women were placed in faith-based homes, often having their babies taken away from them and adopted out in a way that was discriminatory and for Māori legally severed their ties to whakapapa and identity. All of this underscores what almost doesn't need to be said, but must be if we are to be serious about this apology in this place. In this Parliament, the attitudes that we have about the humanity and the worthiness of people and of groups of people inform and create policies that do and can cause real-world harm. That harm did not just happen in state care in the form of immense and devastating physical and sexual abuse. It stayed with the people, and in some cases it multiplied. That harm was the seed that grew gangs in this country, and the state responded largely by compounding that harm. The most obvious place that you will see the impacts of that today is in our prisons, which, as we know, and the data tells us, also fails victims and offenders by producing even more crime, not less. Now, there's a proverb that goes something like, the child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. Some, of course, will rightfully point out that not everyone who has been subject to abuse in state care has ended up down a darker life course. Few may try and argue to rationalise that there's no need for us to change anything about the so-called criminal justice system. Indeed, many members of this House continue to call for harsher penalties, more prison beds and more prisoners. Something has got to give. At one point or another, we must look in the mirror, away from the heat of knee-jerk political campaigns. And the basic question for this House is whether we are serious about transformational change to stop harm at the hand of the state. If we are not, or rather if we are, we need to reconcile that this abuse and the consequences of this abuse are not historic. That abuse and harm cannot be siloed. It is built into the fabric of the way that our state has worked since colonisation in this country established this Parliament. That should not be a controversial statement. We should be brave enough to reflect on the ramifications of decisions made historically and to this day to understand how that shapes the world around us. We can own our history and we can do better. The buck stops here. We either do something or we don't. We either centre the pleas of survivors or we don't. We either tinker or we transform. Now, we here in the Greens can commit wholesale to the foundational recommendation of the report to work in a cross-party manner to establish and to work through the recommendations of the inquiry. And that brings me to the point of redress. Of course, there can and there must be financial compensation for those whose lives that state and faith-based care upended. But more so than that, and as we heard this morning, survivors deserve and want real justice. That means that this apology must transcend into ensuring that no people are ever subjected to this at the hand of the state ever again. And to get really real and frank, what that means and what survivors this morning told us is that that means no military-style boot camps. It means retention of Section 7AA of the Oranga Tamariki Act, at the very least. It means upholding and honouring and ensuring that the fabric of our state honours Te Tiriti o Waitangi. It means a complete transformation of our criminal justice system, as Taruki, the Safe and Effective Justice Review, chaired by the late, great Chester Burrows, demanded of us. It means if we are to do things differently here, we need to genuinely do things differently here. We are here to work with survivors and across the aisle to ensure that this inquiry tabled today represents the first step in a story of restorative justice. To victims and survivors, this is something that you should hold all of us here, politically, but also personally responsible for. An apology can never just be words alone. Change and action must follow. For at the end of the day, what is the most important thing in the world? He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. It is people, it is people, it is people.
I call on the Honourable Karen Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As today is a day of reflection and acknowledgement of the past, I would just like to take a moment to acknowledge those who are no longer with us, those who never had a chance to hear their voices heard, those souls who left this world only knowing the horrors they experienced, the cruelty and the unbearable treatment that they received. And my heart goes out to them. I'd also like to acknowledge everyone who is in the gallery here today or watching from afar. I know this will not be easy for many. I know our words here today cannot and will never take away the pain of what has happened. But I do pray it goes a little way towards lifting the lifetime of frustration of not being heard, not being believed, and for that, I am truly sorry. Today, we table a document in this House that is evidence of systematic abuse that went ignored for decades by those who were supposed to protect us. Through inadequate responses by those who knew, suspected abuse was going on, through inadequate screening management or accountability of abusive people who were working in the system, through children, young people, and those with disabilities and with mental health challenges being ignored or dismissed when they tried to speak up. As both Minister for Prevention of Family and Sexual Violence and Minister for Children, this report is extremely important. It helps myself and those working within this space now to have a true understanding of how the state and faith-based agencies so badly failed in their basic duty of care and protection. It lays down the challenge for us going forward when we create systems and policies and practices that they uphold the rights and the well-being of those in need and protection. It has been extremely hard and distressing to read the individual stories of victim survivors who speak not only of what happened to them back as children, but also how that abuse has impacted throughout their lives and as adults, and the generational trauma that persists in their often complicated relationships with their families to this day. The fact that so many offenders were able to victimise and harm repeatedly for years on end, negatively impacting countless children and their families for generations long past their own lifetimes, is devastating and unacceptable. The ease with which these crimes were committed is horrifying. These perpetrators knew that society was conditioned to not believe young victims. These monsters used their positions of authority both as a weapon and a shield. Children believed that police, government and other adults who were complicit in the abuse due to the stonewalling of their cries for help, and rightly so. We must take a long, hard look at not only the perpetrators, but those who enabled this abuse to continue for so long by choosing to look the other way. Which is why I cannot express this enough. If you see something, say something. Too many of us have failed and still to this day are failing to do this. There are deep connections between both my portfolios. Many of those in care and the protection system are there due to family violence and sexual violence being part of their everyday lives. And it is unacceptable to remove a child from harm only to place them in an environment that is equally unsafe or worse. What is important now is that we continue to drive change. I cannot stand here and say with my hand on heart that young people are no longer being hurt in care. But what I can say, and what I should be able to say, is that my expectation is that they will listen, they will be believed, and we will address it immediately. To not do so is unacceptable. I have made my expectations crystal clear that the children's system as a whole needs to work to recognise harm and stop it from happening. We are making changes to address the issues in care and protection system, but there is way more to do, and it is far from perfect. Some of those working to make the change we need to see and are making the real differences are Oranga Tamariki staff who were themselves survivors, who suffered trauma too, and joined the organisation to fight for change from the inside. And I want to acknowledge those people today. We need the care system as a whole for children and for adults across all settings and environments to become increasingly safer for those who need it. We know that children and young people who were put into these environments were often already victims of abuse, harm or trauma, which was only made worse by their new living conditions and the lack of sufficient support and care. Time and time again, the report points out Māori being disproportionately affected, being massively overrepresented in numbers of children and young people taken from their homes and put into state care. No one, regardless of their race, gender or any other identity, deserves to be in a situation where they are abused and denied basic care. And I am committed to doing everything within my power to ensure that no child or young person in New Zealand suffers abuse in state or faith-based care. I want capable workforces who respect those that they work with, social norms that respect everyone, and systems that respond appropriately when we don't. Events at residences such as Apuni were appalling. This has been the driving force for me, focusing on ensuring that residences of today are the best that they can be. The severity of what these children went through, repeatedly referred to as hell on earth. Their time in state or faith-based care included stories of electric shocks, injections as punishment, physical and sexual abuse, extended solitary confinement, emotional and psychological abuse, not to mention the continuous racism, ableism, and homophobia. According to the definition outlined by the Solicitor General, the children who were sent to Lake Alice went through torture. The unchecked power that people had over children in far too many facilities across this nation, combined with access to isolated physical environments away from families and support networks, led to the ideal environment for abusers to do whatever they wanted with little to no consequences. This quote from Stolen Lives, Mark Soul's report, sums up the nature of the abuse clearly. These men used and abused their spiritual and physical power and dominance, destroyed the lives of children, and then discarded them. A Victim, Survivor and Beautiful Children report talks about the vicious cycle these children were caught up in. After being sexually abused by a man in charge of referrals to Lake Alice, a boy tried to commit suicide. He says, "He did it to me, and I complained, and I wasn't listened to. I tried to kill myself. And because of that, that's how I ended up in Lake Alice." You see what happens. They violate you, they complain, you get punished further, and nothing happens to the perpetrator. Silence is golden. When these children would rightfully lash out or react to the abuse by trying to run away or misbehaving, their abusers would use that as evidence against them to justify locking them up, further mistreating or punishing them, and using the behaviour to discredit these children as not trustworthy and able to be ignored. I have my own personal trauma related to dealing with state care, and this report affects me deeply. I am filled with compassion for the hardships and the trauma that so many have endured and to continue to suffer from. This report has renewed my determination to break the cycle of family violence and sexual violence. It's time we face this poison that is rotting our nation from the inside. Because of this, I also feel an enormous level of responsibility to be a strong advocate and a leader of change, to ensure that not only those who suffered abuse as children long ago, but also those in the system today are heard, and our entire system responds to them in a safe and appropriate way. I commend the courage of those who came forward about their abuse, despite being silenced and not being believed in the past. I also would like to acknowledge those who may not have submitted, but suffered all the same. I will do everything in my power to make sure that nothing like this can happen again. You have my commitment to listen, to learn from the experiences that you have shared. What has happened is clearly unacceptable. This report tells us that we tolerated rape and abuse of vulnerable people and the misuse of power for far too long. It is time to learn from our mistakes and change. This report and its recommendations are confronting, powerful and clear. A lot of the stories contained within are extremely vivid and deeply shocking. This did not just happen in a few isolated cases or situations. The abuse was systematic, continuous, and sadly normalised. Abusing a position of authority over those who have no ability to stand up for themselves and who needed protection and love at such a critical time in their development is a crime beyond measure. It is important that we act decisively and honour the courage of these victims and survivors by making sure that something like this never happens again.
I call on the Honourable Casey Costello.
Mr Speaker, I speak on behalf of New Zealand First as part of the Government's response to the Royal Commission's report into historical abuse in state care and in the care of faith-based institutions. Firstly, I would acknowledge the powerful words that have been spoken already today. I would also acknowledge the nearly 3,000 survivors who shared their experiences of abuse and neglect with the Commission. For those of you who are here today, welcome and thank you. For those who have not made it to this day, for those who have passed, it is my hope they know that we all in this House are hearing your voices, seeing your faces and feeling your pain. The report we are speaking to today has captured the attention of our nation and brought so many together to hear and hopefully to understand. I particularly want to acknowledge those of you who are here today. It is being here that makes these pages come to life. When in the coming days, weeks and months that we come together to discuss, reflect and respond, it will be your faces that keep us focused on the pathway forward. This is the day when Parliament has come together to speak to you all, not just to those of you who are here, but to all the voices that were not previously heard, all the faces not previously seen, and the experiences not previously believed. The Royal Commission's report brought you to visit Parliament, perhaps for some of you, the first time. I hope that it now becomes your Parliament and a place where you can feel that the House of Representatives is not talking about you, but that we are representing you. No matter your politics, no matter your party affiliations or political outlook, I believe every member in this chamber knows that the key role of the state is to protect our most vulnerable. Every society should be judged by how we care for and protect those who need it most. This report is our judgment. We are here today recognising that this is a shameful part of New Zealand's history. As a society and as the Crown, we should have done better. As you have heard already today, we are determined that we will do better, not through political posturing, but through a collective will. When we enter this House as the elected representatives of New Zealand, we make what is called our maiden speech. The first words you speak to introduce who you are, the first words that tell the world about why you were brought to this place, and more importantly, what you aspire to achieve. One of the most common messages you will hear in those maiden speeches is the desire to be able to come together across the political divide to truly make a difference. It is clear to me, and from the words spoken here, we are united to make that difference. And I thank you for bringing us to this place. I have been part of the ministerial group that was established by Cabinet to guide the government's response to the Royal Commission's recommendations. And I can assure you of the passion, determination and commitment led by Minister Stanford to achieve what we are promising here today. It is my belief that we have an opportunity, we have the will, and we will continue to do better well beyond today. Early in my working life, I joined the police. It is now many years since I ended that part of my career. But in the 14 years of my service, I looked into the eyes of many victims. No matter how long it has been and how far away from that work I have ventured, I still see those eyes and I see those faces. Whether it was a child who had been the victim of recent abuse and the wounds were still visible and the pain still evident, or whether it was a grown adult who was recounting the pain from many years ago, the experiences have never left me. I can still see the pattern of a pair of pyjamas. I can still see the colour of their eyes that had lost the ability to shed tears. I can recall a turn of phrase in recounting events of trauma and pain. I can still be returned to those events and those instances of suffering. No matter how long ago I was involved in the investigations, I can be taken back to that place by a smell, a pattern, or a word. It is hard to comprehend how, as a survivor, that recall must impact you every day. It was through walking through that journey from victim to survivor that I am able to begin to understand how hard your journey has been. And in some way, it helps me understand what it must have been like for those who have shared their experiences in the report, having to fight so hard to be heard. Even when a victim is immediately heard, when they are immediately responded to and intervention put in place, it is still a hard journey to walk. To have to fight to have your story heard is a pain that I cannot even begin to reconcile in my mind. I tried to reconcile a particular face that I see often when I close my eyes. Not because of the suffering he endured. This poor little boy was tortured. But because of the absolute shining light of joy that he showed when he smiled. The saddest thing was that despite all the suffering, the joy came from the smallest act of kindness. He was given a lollipop from a nurse and his face lit up, and I still see that smile. As I've been reading these pages and absorbed the accounts of abuse, it reminds me that for these survivors, for all of you, who had so little shown to you in way of kindness and love, it would have been such small interventions that could have made a difference and for a moment brought you some joy. Perhaps today, as we speak and recognise the strength, resilience, perseverance and courage, there will be some light. Mr. Speaker, today is significant. The Royal Commission's report is now public. Most importantly, survivors' stories are now public. New Zealand can read these and reflect. As the public and all of us read, reflect and absorb, I would also like to acknowledge those who worked to bring it to us, the commissioners and all those who committed to a journey that at its start had no clear destination. Pathway changed and it was a longer process than we first considered. I know how hard it is looking into the face of suffering. Thank you all for bringing this report to us. We are not yet at a destination. The government is continuing to digest the Commission's final report. This report was 6 years in the making, The response cannot be rushed. It needs to be considered with respect and care. So many lives have been affected over so many years. You are individuals, you have your own views reflecting your own experiences, including how we should respond to the recommendations and findings made by the Royal Commission. We know, however, that survivors have waited a long time for this report and are eager to see action. We owe it to people to understand what happened and to ensure we deliver our response with the respect and dignity it deserves. We know, however, that survivors have waited a long time for this report and are eager to see action. But for today, in this place, you should know you are seen, you are heard, you are valued, and you are believed. It has been a hard and painful. It will have been hard and painful to share your story. It has been hard and painful to read it. However, you must know that after we all leave this place, when we have taken the action agreed and delivered what is needed, your story will never fade out. We have heard your voice, we have seen your face and felt your pain. Today, you have changed lives, moved hearts and opened eyes. Thank you.
Call on Debbie narewa packer.
Tēnā koe e te tia mana i te pika. Tuatahi ngā me kia koutou kua tai mai ki te kawea ki te tautoko te kāpua pauri a kore te āhua o te hui. Arrive here and unshackle the weight. Unshackle the weight of the trauma of everything that you have carried and had to listen to. This is not the place for your rongoa. The place for your rongoa is in your moana, by your maunga, by your awa, by your hapu, by your marae. This is the place where you lay your mamai and you leave it here. You leave it here with those with the forked tongue. Do not walk out of here. To those watching this, do not leave here. Do not leave here without dumping that mamai that you have had to carry and pass on. 655 children, rangatahi pahake, went through our state care system. Over 200,000 were abused. That we know of. That we know of. And I want to mihi to whanakitea. I want to mihi to what it is that you have left us. For those who are brave and left us this. For those who represent us who could not contribute to this. We will hold this and we will never let this place of trauma forget it. Ever. Because that is what we fight for. I've had to listen and I'll try and hold it back. I've had to listen to the fact that those who targeted our people because they were Māori, they were takatapui, they were tangata waikaha, they were tangata turi, and they were poor. That's why we were targeted. What the hell has changed? What the hell has changed? You listen to all the richness of the kōrero today, but what the hell has changed for us? Bernie Rudu O'Donnell said it. I get really tired of seeing the looks to the horror stories that he has to repeat. The Crown must be held accountable to the abuse and for the abuse because it was criminal. And it is criminal negligence. E te wanaunga, ka tautoko aho. There must be consequences. There is no time to digest. We need time to digest, but they were quick to uplift, quick to move, quick to ruin us, quick to displace us, quick to forget Article 2, undisturbed access and rights to all our whenua, our taonga, to us as being Māori, quick to do that. Do not accept, do not leave here accepting that this report must be digested slowly. For Christ's sake, my mokopuna can see what's needed. I want to share with some words that we were we were exposed to during the hearings, so that this place becomes about you and not us politicians saying aye 500 times. Tupua Ulich, who's from Ngāti Kahungunu ki Hiratonga, he shared the experience of being in state care from the age of 5. He was placed in multiple foster homes and attended 9 schools in 12 years. He missed school so many times because of his bruising and the injuries that he was enduring by a state-approved caregiver. Hooked in the head at 5 years old by a fully grown man, crying and bleeding on the floor, told that his father had just passed away, knowing that that was his only source of justice that was ever going to come and save him. A child at the mercy of a monster. No one checked in on him, but he was quick to be uplifted and slow to be checked in on. What's changed? Terrified, having to test in the CCTV against a defence lawyer, and what happened? That caregiver got 30 months community service. What have we learnt? Ihorangi Rewati Peters of Ngāti Tūwharetoa, Ngāti Kahungunu and Ngāti Tahu Ngāti Whaiao descent, placed in state care at a very young age, shared his lived experiences of physical and mental abuse, and while he's ended up in some really great situations, to get there was horrific. 7 placements in 6 years, using his experience to ensure rangatahi don't endure what he had to, bravely fronting a call to action to improve access for mental health and counselling support. What's changed? Are we there? Glenda Maihi of Te Arawa descent, placed in foster care by the Department of Social Welfare from the age of 5. She spoke about the physical, psychological trauma she experienced during these placements. She discussed recommendations. She does not want any other child to endure what she went through. Do we listen? Tūmohi Clark, Ngāti Haua, Ngāti Koreki Kahukura, shared the experience of abuse in state care he had, what he suffered, the impact that it's had on his whānau across generations. Te Aroha Knox of Waikato Tainui in Ngāpui went into care at 10 years old because of abuse at home, went through foster homes, different institutions, and she shared how Te Whare Tapawhā model has helped her in her journey of healing. Karanui Whānui Queenie was placed in state care at the age of 11 due to truancy. She was sexually abused in 2 of her 3 homes she was placed in. As an adult, she used her Māori values to care for other tamariki. She cares, and she shared her story so the government can better understand how to look after our tamariki today. What's happened? Paula Sweeney grew up in a loving family but suffered trauma due to the loss of his parents. He had multiple experiences placed in care, custody facilities as an adolescent, experienced being abused in care. He talks about the clear link of that experience between being placed in care and ending up in gangs and adult incarceration. How do we treat gangs today? Do we understand how they got here? Wiremu Waikiri, Kari, Ngāti Porou descent, reclaimed his ingoa as a form of rejecting the abuse that he experienced in care, turned to his taha Māori to help him recover from the physical, psychological, sexual abuse and racism. He's now a qualified social worker. He works as a Māori consultant, a Māori advisor. He found lungua in his taha Māori, in being Māori, and not having to defend being Māori. Harry Tutahi, taken into care as a young boy. He shared his experiences and all the time he spent in prison as a teenager, as a young adult. Waina Kotara, Māori and Scottish descent, shared her lived experiences of abuse and the pathway that she chose and the way that she thinks that could be used to actually help and re-navigate other children in tamariki in care. Nothing learned, nothing learned. All of these experiences have been shared with the rongoa of how taha Māori helps them. And yet here we are in the government that's saying how sorry it is, but it continues to create mega prisons, removes 7AA of oranga tamari and experiments with our rangatahi injustice in boot camps. Everything that you have told us in this has been ignored. Every experience that you've asked us to think about continues to be perpetuated by this monstrous system that you've talked about. The system that continues to protect the system that perpetuated and created harm isn't held accountable. This is on your head, government. This is on all your heads, governments. We cannot leave out of here, have rich words, and then tomorrow we go back to having to defend why tikanga Māori, why te tiriti o Waitangi, why Māori rongoa, why our own solutions by Māori for Māori work. Because in here, they are telling us how we fight the trauma. They are telling us what it was that they had to do to get over it all. And we cannot continuously pretend to have all these ideas of what it feels like, when in fact the first thing we've done is ignored every experience that was shared with us to 1999. And we do know. We've got ministers stand up that they can't say hand on heart that this isn't still going on today. Though I'm sure as hell bloody concerned. Because we do know. And as long as we're here, Te Pāti Māori will hold the ground and fight against the trauma that we have to keep explaining why we have inequities and explaining why we should not be attacking gangs and explaining why Loretta and explaining why Eugene, why we must have brave faces that hide broken faces. We should not be attacking why we've ended up in this situation. We should be working with the lived experiences and learn from it. Otherwise, all of this is just lip service and looks really great for the international governments. Looks really great. So we will not stop until the last of our breath goes out. And I can sit here and I can say that this place stops creating harm for not just our people, but all of our people and all of our mokopuna. Kia kaha whānau.
I call on the Honourable Erica Stanford.
I ngā mana, I ngā reo, I ngā morehu. Koutou kua haere ki tua, koutou kei te noho mai, he ka nohi ki tia, tēnā koutou katoa. Mr. Speaker, today is historic as we table the Royal Commission report, with an apology to follow on the 12th of November, and we will work alongside, and we are working alongside survivors to design how and where that apology takes place. Thousands of incredibly brave survivors, many who have made the journey here today to Parliament, have told their stories that are now permanently etched on the pages of history. And the record in those pages is a dark stain on New Zealand's past. The stories contained in this report serve to all New Zealanders a very harsh jolt of reality, because I think we believed that these sorts of unimaginable horrors and atrocities never happened here, that they happened in other places to other people. But because of you, we know that they happened here. They happened at scale, and they destroyed so many lives. Today, these stories are shared with all of New Zealand. As the lead minister for the Crown response, I have read all of your stories. The young people that were taken into care were disabled, they were neurodiverse, they may have had a traumatic upbringing. Some were put into care for hardly any reason at all. Many of you don't understand why you were put into care and protection at all. But all of those young people needed care and love and protection. They needed an education. They needed specialist support. They needed to be cared for, they needed to be nurtured, and they needed to be loved. Instead, they were placed in facilities and in homes that they describe as hellholes. And reading the stories, I was struck by the way that so many of your accounts were so disturbingly similar. There was little or no education. Violence was vicious and it was normalised. Beatings from carers were regular. Solitary confinement was used sometimes for weeks and weeks on end. Sexual abuse was rife and on children so very young. Food was restricted and racism was a constant. There were weak systems, there were weak oversights, and there was certainly weak accountability. At the boot camps on Great Barrier, boys were forced to dig their own graves. They were made to lie face down in those holes while they were being shot at. They screamed and they were terrified. The staff were not vetted. They were not trained in care and protection. They were tormentors. At so many boys' facilities, the adults were not dishing out the beatings themselves, were encouraging those boys to viciously beat each other. At the psychiatric facilities, patients were drugged, they were sexually abused and they were beaten, they were given ECT, they were spent weeks in solitary confinement, they were racially abused, and they regressed. Many of the people in those institutions should never have been there. There was no reason for them to be there. In faith-based homes, pregnant mothers were denied food so that they would have smaller babies and easier births. And their babies were ripped away from them and adopted out without the chance for a mother to hold her newborn and say goodbye. There was often no medical follow-up for the damage that was caused during birth. Young girls in faith-based care were given abortions without their knowledge and without their consent to cover up this abuse. These people, you, tried speaking out. It got you nowhere. Nobody believed you and it was safer just to stay silent. Many would attempt to run away from the horrors, to be picked up and taken back and be abused again. One particular account noted that after particularly awful sexual abuse, I ran away that morning, but the police caught me within hours, and when I got back, he was still there, he was waiting for me. Story after story say the same thing. Nobody ever asked us why we ran away. No one at the places we were sent to asked about our home lives, asked why we behaved the way that we did. We were treated like prisoners, as quoted in the report. The result of these institutions and facilities were that young people were broken, they were separated from their whānau, they were denied their reo, their sign language, their culture. Some recounted turning to substance abuse to numb the pain. And years of violence in care was normalised and so often played a part of the rest of their lives. For so many survivors, they spent stints in jail where they would meet, as we've heard, other survivors they had spent time with in the past. So many survivors found solace in gangs, because gangs were the first place where they were cared about. To the survivors, you repeatedly spoke truth to those who you thought were there to protect you, and too often you were ignored. The abuse was covered up, the investigations were botched, or the investigations didn't happen at all. The Crown owed you all a duty of care and protection, and we have utterly failed you. E kore e ia I te kupu taku aroha mō koutou. And while we have come so far, in too many cases we have not come far enough. The stories of survivors are too often mirrored in what we hear today. Young boys in oranga tamariki care who are fighting each other in MMA-style fights, being filmed by the staff who were not vetted, who were not trained in care and protection. These stories may well have been in these reports, but they're happening now. These are our most vulnerable and damaged tamariki, and this report tells us today that we must do better. And as a government, we are committed to delivering our response to the report with the respect and dignity it deserves. But today is about the survivors. Today we hear your stories. Today we acknowledge your bravery. And your bravery will not only correct the historic record, but it will determine our future. You are brave. We acknowledge you. And we thank you. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
E te māngai o te whare.
I call on the Honourable Willow Jean Prime.
Tēnā koe te māngai o te whare. Me pēhia rā a hau, e kōrero ki tēnei take, ki roto I te whare i tēnei ahi. Au we taukiri e. Au we te mamai. Au we te kino. Au we taku aroha mō koutou ngā morehu kei roto i te whare i tēnei ahi. Koutou e whakakanohi nei i te tini me te mano. Rātou ko wehe ki te pō. Rātou ka hore i tai ki te tuku o rātou kōrero. Taku mihi, kauana, aroha kia koutou, mō tō koutou kaha, maia, manawa nui, manawa roa. Tēnā koutou katoa. I don't even know how to begin to express my thoughts and feelings about what we are here debating this afternoon, what has been delivered to this whare. It is painful. It is heartbreaking. I admire your strength and your courage, your determination and your perseverance. I want to acknowledge that the many that are here today, in fact, represent many, many more, hundreds, thousands who could not be here today, those who have passed, those who did not present to the Royal Commission. You represent them. I had the privilege of meeting a few survivors before this afternoon's proceedings, and I recognise how traumatic and how triggering this is for all of you. They said to me it takes them back to those very moments, like it was just yesterday. And it has been 60 plus years for some of those people. What I felt so heartening from those conversations is that their determination and their perseverance is purely so that it does not happen to another tamaiti, to another tamariki. Despite their own traumatic experiences, which we have heard some of this afternoon, they are here for others, and I mihi to all of you. We welcome this report. We welcome the opportunity to work through the 138 recommendations in that report. You have heard acknowledgements from all parties in the House this afternoon. You have heard all parties saying they are committed to this issue and that they want to work on resolving these issues and ensuring it doesn't happen again. There are 138 recommendations. When I look at those recommendations, our current system is so out of step with what is recommended that there is a huge job for us to do. The report is harrowing, it's confronting the atrocities that have been suffered. It was unacceptable and disgraceful, and we owe it to the survivors to read the report, to understand the recommendations, and then to take action. I am sure that all of you who have fought so hard to get us to this point today will continue to hold all of the politicians you have heard from this afternoon accountable to deliver the action that is needed to ensure that this does not continue. One person wanted me to mention in the House and get on the Hansard, this is not a historical issue, it is an issue that is still happening today. I want to acknowledge the rangatahi who were excluded because of the 1999 timeframe. They have presented their additional report for our consideration. Voice Whakarongo Mai has that on their website. I encourage you to read it. And they wanted to give this message. Iho Rangirewiti Peters sent it to me by text message, designed by Ruby Jones in collaboration with Kara Mackie, survivors of abuse care. Our rangatahi are saying, we fought to survive, now help us to thrive. He wero tērā ki tēnei whare. Kia tātou katoa I roto I tēnei whare. Ko reira, I runga no I wera whakaro, tēnā koutou, kia ora hui hui mai tātou katoa.
Call on Kahurangi Carter.
Makurapia, makurapia, makukoe e awhie, ki te ara, ara tupu, makukoe e awhie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of the Green Party of Aotearoa to hold space alongside survivors, both past and present, who have selflessly made sacrifices in reliving their traumatic experiences in the hope of achieving a better future for our mokopuna and our future generations. You deserve to be safe, loved and nurtured, but shamefully, you were denied these basic rights. Words cannot adequately convey the systemic failures and injustices continually perpetuated for decades by the state. And for that, I am deeply, deeply sorry. The state was a place in which you were meant to be safe. It was the very same New Zealand that portrayed itself, both home and abroad, as a sanctuary of human rights, a secure and just nation where children thrived in loving families. If we do not confront this systemic injustice and recognise that the state continues to be the largest perpetuator of violence and abuse towards tamariki, the stain on our national character will be permanent. I want to express my heartfelt gratitude and mihi to morehu, survivors, whānau, communities, iwi and support networks who bravely advocated and participated in this inquiry. We stand beside you and will continue to hold the space that is required to heal, redress and fight so this never happens again. Your advocacy has been a beacon of hope and solidarity throughout this harrowing process. Your unwavering determination, patience and courage have been the cornerstone of our efforts, shaping the findings and recommendations aimed at creating a society where everyone can flourish with dignity and pride. I appreciate the immense difficulty in sharing your experiences, especially for those speaking out for the first time, and extend my deepest aroha to those unable to come forward due to fear, loss of trust, or the overwhelming pain of their past. We honour and remember those who have passed away, including those who tragically took their own lives during this process, acknowledging their family and friends, and recognising the lasting impact their stories on our journey towards justice and healing. This Royal Commission inquiry has once again shone a spotlight on the systemic inequalities baked into the fabric of our institutions. We know time and time again that those who bear the greatest harm of the state's failings, those who have been time and time again let down by the very institutions that were meant to protect them, are Māori, Pacific, disabled, rainbow and impoverished tamariki. This report shamefully highlights the failings in the care system, and I quote the inquiry, Tamariki, rangatahi and Pākeke Māori were often targeted because of their ethnicity, and this was often overlaid with racism. The effects of colonisation continue to further keep many whānau Māori in social deprivation, with resulting impacts on whānau well-being and financial instability. This inquiry is a testament to the collective strength, mana and resilience of those whose voices are reflected in this report and beyond. The hope for a better future is found within the recommendations, all 138 of them. We welcome the apology that will be offered by the Prime Minister on behalf of the state. However, an apology is hollow without change. The Green Party is unified in its cross-partisan support to accept and implement in full all recommendations and implores the government to join us. Whilst my words can never come close to healing the decades of neglect, trauma and failings of the state, what I can offer you is my unwavering dedication to the relentless fight for the recommendations to be fully implemented. Because our tamariki, our mokopuna and our future generations depend on it. Mauri ora.
Call on the Honourable David Seymour.
Mr Speaker, I start by acknowledging those of the 200,000 that we know about who were abused, who did not get to see this day because they passed before it came, because it took too long. Those who were put in dark places where the last people that they thought they could trust turned out to abuse them further, physically, psychologically, sexually, medically, educationally, culturally, in every way that a person could be abused, they were. And yet they never lived to see this acknowledgement today. This is their day and the day of all survivors. For those who are here today and those who participated in this commission, this is the day that perhaps many thought would never come. Because the thing that bullies and abusers do, that they all have in common, no matter what form they take, is that they try to deny your reality, to stop you seeing and saying and asserting your truth and what has happened to you. This report finally puts on the table of this House of Parliament, your Parliament, a formal acknowledgement of what has happened, and it was hideous. Some people who have spoken today have made apologies and some haven't. I want to be clear that people on this side with the government have not apologised today because we believe it is so important that we make sure that this report and its recommendations are properly considered, and the form of apology and anything else that goes with it is not done to those survivors, but actually created with them so that it is genuine. And I think the spirit we've heard today, that people from all political stripes will put down their political perspectives and work together in order to have that sincere apology and redress is not just welcome, it's the only way that it should be. And in that process, we all have to learn. All of us have beliefs. There are some who have already tried to bring politics into today. We should not do that. There are things that we need to learn and acknowledge that, yes, the state failed. The state failed in three ways. It failed to run safe institutions of its own. And anyone who's lived in a place where you are on a site that you may not be allowed or able to leave, with a select group of people, perhaps with walls and people who are put in charge, you can see whether or not abuse happened at the place you lived. If you've lived in a place like that, you can see how strong the potential is. And the second thing that the state failed to do was have the accountability and the oversight and the protection, given that very obvious danger in any kind of residential facility or institution, not only in its own facilities, but in facilities run by faith-based and other organisations. And the third way that the state failed is that even when people pointed out what was wrong, and someone says failing, and that's fair, but for the purpose of this report, the way that it failed is that it covered up. When people thought that they might be listened to, it was covered up. And I acknowledge that there has been some of the worst human prejudices against people of a different gender, people of different sexuality, people of different race, people living with a disability. Those prejudices came out in these horrible places. But one of the things that we have to accept, beside the fact that the state is not always essentially good, that sometimes it's the God that failed, is that if we hate in ourselves that prejudice that has come out in these places, then we must recommit ourselves to a state that upholds the inherent human dignity of each and every human being, no matter the hue or creed from whence they come. That is the lesson we should take and should recommit ourselves as we work through the process of apology and redress as a result of this report. It is for all New Zealand, finally, not only to acknowledge that the state failed, but all of us have to look at the country that we thought was above these bad things, that it could never happen on such a scale or so grotesquely, that we were good people and bad things happened elsewhere. Actually, it did happen here. And it is not only the state that failed, it is on all of us to be better parents, to be more caring, to listen to people when we think that they're being ignored, because government and state and government alone cannot fix this problem. It actually rests on all New Zealanders. Mr. Speaker, this is the day for those survivors, and especially to remember those who survived but could not see this report published today. The days to come are the days that we must commit to doing better in every way available to us.
I call on the Honourable Judy Marcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I begin my contribution in acknowledgement of the survivors gathered here today at Parliament. I mihi to Eugene Ryder and also to Loretta, my brother-in-law's uncle and auntie, tēnā kōrua. The final report of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in Care raises many difficult, complex and serious issues that go to the heart of the ways in which our society has attempted to deal with those placed in the care of the state, the welfare state. A great many of those children and young people who were already abused and traumatised were placed in institutions like Templeton, Lake Alice, Tokanui, Sunnyside, and countless others whose names have acquired an unpleasant aura. That aura has not come about by accident. The inquiry reveals shocking detail, stories that are incredibly harrowing, that have impacted large numbers of people, their families, and communities. Damaged survivors who were traumatised by their treatment, or should I say, mistreatment. I am the daughter of a survivor. My mother was strapped to electrodes and delivered electric shock therapy as a young university student. She was locked up without her consent or the consent of her parents and subjected to inhumane, barbaric treatment in the late 1950s. One of thousands of stories just like yours. I'm horrified, I'm shocked and deeply disturbed by all of the stories in the report detailing the scale of abuse, the various ways in which abuse was carried out, by whom it was carried out, and concealed and sustained over generations. That the abuse became normalised and integrated into the culture of so-called care is a gross inversion of the purpose of healing and restoration, and is a shameful stain on our nation. The summary of the report has two very clear messages. Bad things happen to people when they are disempowered, when they are segregated away from view, and when they are silenced. Different kinds of bad things arise in people who are put in charge of vulnerable people. Why they become bullies seem to be baked into the institutional architecture, and it's still there. This, of course, is nothing new. Everyone who's ever done Psych 101 has heard of the Milgram experiment and the Stanford prison experiments. We can hardly claim ignorance as an excuse. Every psychologist, counsellor and social worker up and down the long white cloud has known that people become corrupted by power when it is not held to account. It is easy to point the finger at those who carried out the instances of abuse and make judgments upon them. The perpetrators will no doubt live with the lie that they are decent people. Their victims, however, will have to live under the shadow of horrible memories and psychological scars as best they can. Many of them were convinced by the perpetrators that they were not good people and that they somehow deserved the torments that were inflicted upon them. Others knew that they did not deserve this abuse, but their voices were silenced. Sadly, many of the abusers and victims, like my mother, are no longer alive, and much damage has been done that cannot now be undone for them. This report brings us back to the question of how we respond appropriately to the needs of people who require some form of care. This is a question common to all societies. As Mahatma Gandhi said, the true measure of any society can be seen in how it deals with the most vulnerable. Whilst a lot of energy and resources could and should be brought to provide some relief to those who suffered at the hands of those caring for them, it would be even more wrong to not rethink what it means to provide care to people in New Zealand in the third decade of the 21st century. This rethinking will have to re-examine fundamental questions about why caring is important to wider society and the value of individuals. We, who make policies that affect those we serve, have to be willing to put ourselves in the shoes and the hospital gowns of those we design policies for. Our time in history is both similar and different from the time in which the welfare state arose. Similar in that we are beset by large-scale needs, but we no longer have the same wide-eyed confidence in science and institutions to solve the problems that we had in the latter part of the 20th century. But we must tread very carefully and thoughtfully if we are to avoid repeating the evil of the past. If we deny vulnerable individuals their humanity, what would that say about ourselves? The question I ask myself, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, and I ask all of you here today, how would we want to be cared for if we ourselves or someone close to us requires the state's support? To be cared for in a humane way, with our dignity preserved and where we are treated with compassion. I acknowledge the significance of this historic report and the collective efforts of everyone who has contributed to it. While a Crown apology is to come and some redress made, it is my hope that all victims know that their voices have been heard and will contribute to meaningful change. And in closing, to all the victims, living and past, I hope you find peace.
call on Maria Meno Kapakingi.
Tēnā koe te pika, tēnā tātou. Tūana rā I te pōuriuri anganui ana ki tēnei pupuru kōrero. Anei ngā puta ki te ao mārama. E ara, hei ngā manua kua irihia ki runga tēnā no tātou katoa. E rere rā ko ngā tangi kōrero, ko ngā tangi tikanga, ko ngā tangi roimata ki rungi ki enei ki ngā purapura ora kia tupu kere kere, kua tupu wana wana. Tēnā tātou. My hope is that we see the full whakapapa of this report as opposed to just the letters and numbers on the paper. That we see the sickening irony of the phrase abuse in care. That we see the faces of all the innocent babies who have died in these Pākehā institutions, with some of their bones laying underneath unmarked graves. This world may have forgotten you, but your tupuna won't. And I know your kuia, hine nui te pō, will be loving you now in a way this world did not have the heart to do. Moi mai rā koutou. That we see the faces who were hated and abused because they were brown, because they loved in their own way, because they were different, because they were born without the privileges that able-bodied people enjoy. Faces that longed for ones like theirs to tell them who they are, to speak to their wairua through the reo and tikanga of their tupuna, to say they love them, to make them whole. Faces that screamed over and over into an empty void, completely devoid of aroha, completely devoid of care. To all of you beautifully made mokopuna, I see you, I see your pain, but I also see your power. Ko tō mana, no hawaiki mai, no rangiātea mai, aha ko te aha e kore e ngaro. You have a just rage within that you shake the world, e hoa mā, let it out. The release of this 3,000-page report, culminating from 6 years of hearing truth and pain, is by no means an end point. It is just the beginning. It has proved to the world beyond any form of doubt the reality of state and church-sanctioned abuse over generations within a system which on paper is meant to care and protect tamariki. It also proves that for years, successive governments have spent more time, effort and money trying to hide that reality, to save its own reputation, as opposed to saving the lives of innocent children. And today, I say to the Pākehā state, you must answer to your crimes against all tamariki. That you have made and watched suffer. The bare minimum response, financial compensation, and enacting all 138 recommendations in this report. And let me say this. When I hear comments like, you know, we thought this was a great country, we never could possibly do this, it's such a privileged statement. Māori, for way too long, have absolutely felt the despise, the distaste, the horror of what Pākehā systemic racism hands to us, right? So absolutely, It is not a shock to us. It is not a surprise. It is not a surprise to Māori at all that these things occurred then and that they occur right now as I'm standing here giving this speech. All roads must lead to Te Tiriti o Waitangi. My tupuna did not sign Te Tiriti to watch their mokopuna die. We are the only ones that can care and love for our own. So, hands off our mokopuna. The best chance we have of protecting our tamariki from state abuse is to keep them out of it in the first place. Our tamariki Māori currently make up 70% of those in state custody, and further, they make up 80% of the currently abused by the state. Imagine the next policy that's going to roll out in the next 2 years. Imagine what that's going to look like. We must dismantle this institution now. Relevant communities, including iwi, hapu, whānau, must be resourced to shape the destinies of their own babies. For us, for Te Pāti Māori, this looks like Mokopuna Māori Authority, which will prioritise Indigenous care models and empower communities. These thoughts aren't a theory. And I just heard my whanaunga, me. And that's because her and I know that working in the department at times back in the late 80s and 90s, we saw it, we fought against it, and still they refused to hear it then. So I mihi to every single whānau member in this house that could make it, and to the thousands that couldn't. We're with you, we see you. Kia kahala tātou.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. That concludes this debate on this motion. Is there to be a waiata at all? No? Okay. Okay. I call on government